Harry and Meghan. Man, where do you even start with this anymore? Because the story that we all thought we knew, the clean version about two people stepping back from royal pressure and choosing privacy and peace, that's just not holding up anymore. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories from random Reddit threads. I'm talking about the kind of analysis that people like Tom Bauer are actually doing, the guy who builds patterns and doesn't just throw opinions around for kicks. When he starts pulling at this thread, people listen. And what he's been finding isn't just about the public drama, it's about how carefully this whole narrative has been managed from the beginning. So let's go back to Archie's birth because that's actually where the cracks started showing. The palace puts out this announcement saying Meghan went into labor in the afternoon. Cool, everyone's excited, big royal moment. But then hours later, they come back with this correction that he was actually born early that morning. 8 hours. That's an 8-hour gap between what they initially said and what actually happened. And look, I get that things move fast with a birth. Communication gets messy, people are excited and not thinking clearly, but this isn't some random parent doing a Facebook post. This is the royal palace. These are official announcements. And when you're talking about the line of succession, about a child who could theoretically be king someday, the documentation matters. It actually matters a lot. This is where the whole body of the child rule comes in. Sounds old, sounds traditional, but it's actually legally important in royal terms. Basically means the kid has to be physically born by the mother to count in the line of succession. It's not just ceremony, it's got real legal weight. So when all that normal process, the official doctors, the documentation, the signatures that usually come with the royal birth, when all of that just kind of disappears with Archie, people start asking questions. And those are legitimate questions, not crazy ones. Like, why isn't there the standard paperwork? Why is the timeline fuzzy? If everything was straightforward, you'd think that would be the easiest thing to clear up right away. But they didn't. They went the other direction. And that's the thing that Tom Bauer and everyone else keeps circling back to. Because in royal circles, you don't just skip those processes. They exist for a reason. They exist to make sure everything is clear, especially when it comes to lineage and succession. And when something that basic isn't transparent, well, people fill in the blanks themselves. It's just what happens. You don't get to keep things vague and then act shocked when people speculate. Then you look at how Harry and Meghan actually manage their kids publicly and compare it to what you see with William and Kate's children. George, Charlotte, Louis, they're just out there. They show up at family events, you see them living their lives, it feels normal. It feels like kids. With Archie and Lilibet, it's completely controlled. You get rare photos, and a lot of the time, the faces aren't even clearly visible. It reads less like we're protecting our children and more like we're carefully curating our brand, which are two really different things. And yeah, every parent wants privacy. I get that. But when it gets this controlled, when every image is so managed, it starts looking less like protection and more like strategy. The Montecito lifestyle doesn't exactly scream, we wanted a quiet life either. That house is expensive. The security, the travel, maintaining that whole world, it adds up incredibly fast. They had those early deals that looked huge, the Netflix contract, the Spotify deal, the book, but things haven't gone smoothly. Spotify literally dropped them, and not quietly either. That whole grifter comment when they left, that was rough. Netflix is still expecting them to produce, so now they're in this weird spot where they kind of need to keep people interested, and a lot of that interest is directly tied to their connection to the royal family. Which is ironic because Harry left specifically to get away from that attention. But now he kind of needs it, and from what's getting out, it's affecting him. People who've known him for years say he's different now. He's constantly online, reading everything, getting pulled into the noise. It's eating at him. The guy wanted distance from media pressure, and instead he walks straight into a completely different version of the same problem. Just without the structure to handle it. Because back in the UK, he had his military friends, people who knew him before any of this, people who kept him grounded. That circle doesn't exist anymore. Now it's PR people, advisors, media consultants, celebrity connections. Those aren't real friendships. Those are work relationships. And when you lose that original support system, when everyone around you is just reinforcing the same perspective, you can lose sight of how things actually look from the outside. Meghan seems to be handling all the pressure differently than Harry is. When things get loud, especially around topics like the kids or the birth stuff, her move hasn't been to explain or clarify. It's been to shut it down. Legal notices, warnings, pressure. Which, okay, might work for a minute. But when people don't get answers, they don't just move on. They get more curious. And when the response is legal action instead of actual explanation, it starts to look like there's something worth hiding, even if there isn't. That's the trap here. Perception runs ahead of reality. And I keep thinking, if this was all completely straightforward, if everything was documented and clear, wouldn't it be easier to just show it? One normal moment with King Charles and the kids, one clear timeline, and half of this noise disappears. But it hasn't happened. The longer it doesn't, the bigger the story becomes. And meanwhile, King Charles and the royal family are just watching this from a distance, not reacting publicly, but definitely paying attention. Not reacting publicly, but definitely paying attention. They understand what's at stake. And their approach seems pretty calculated. Protect the institution first. Handle everything else later. So what you've got now is this weird thing where Harry and Meghan are building this separate world, but that world is still completely tied to the one they walked away from. And that tension isn't going anywhere. There's something else that's interesting about Meghan that people are starting to look back on. Before Harry was even in the picture, before any of this royal stuff, she was already moving in very connected circles. Soho House, high-level networking, people who understood influence and how to position yourself in media. And when you look at the people around her now, it's not completely different. A lot of those same types of connections are still there. Which makes you wonder if this whole transition out of royal life was really this sudden decision, or if it was something that had been building for years. Because the way they stepped into Netflix deals, production contracts, brand positioning, it didn't feel random. It felt planned. And if you think about it, a plan like that only works if people stay interested. And right now, that interest is shifting. It's not curiosity anymore. It's scrutiny. Real hard scrutiny. The finances are under pressure too. Maintaining that Montecito lifestyle isn't cheap. And when deals fall apart publicly like the Spotify thing did, it affects perception in ways that are hard to come back from. The Netflix deal is still active, but it comes with actual expectations. They need to keep producing things that people want to watch, and that's where their biggest problem shows up. If they move away from anything royal related, the attention drops off. But if they keep leaning into it, they're feeding the drama, which is the opposite of what they said they wanted. It's a cycle they literally can't escape from. The speaking events are another thing. The tours, the high-ticket engagements, the appearances, those are all supposed to reinforce their image, position them as thought leaders, or whatever the branding is supposed to be. But the response hasn't been what they probably expected. When they did things in Australia, the reaction was way more critical than supportive. People weren't just sitting there listening anymore. They were questioning the whole thing. What's the actual value here? What's the transparency? And when your entire income stream depends on your reputation, that kind of shift is dangerous. Really dangerous. The whole perception versus reality thing is kind of the core of everything right now. Because even if there are no actual issues, the way Harry and Meghan have handled everything has created this environment where people assume there must be something. And you know what the kicker is? Staying silent used to work. Earlier in all this, just keeping quiet could actually calm things down. Not anymore. Now silence does the opposite. Every unanswered question turns into 10 new theories. Every legal pushback adds another layer of curiosity. It's feeding the beast instead of starving it. And inside royal circles, there are conversations happening that we don't see. Protocols, rules, legal frameworks, these things don't just disappear because times change. The monarchy still runs on structure and documentation. If there are gaps in records or verification, especially around something as important as lineage and succession, those systems eventually push for answers. That's what people underestimate about this. It's not just about headlines and what's trending on Twitter. It's about actual records, actual documentation, the kind of stuff that stays on paper long after public opinion moves on to something else. And right now, there are gaps. Whether they're small or significant, they exist. And that's what keeps this alive. What makes it more complicated is that this situation has created this feedback loop that nobody seems to know how to break. Harry and Meghan need the public's interest to keep their deals valuable. But that interest is now tied to scrutiny and questions rather than goodwill. And the more they try to control the narrative, the more it backfires. The more they go silent, the more people speculate. The more they respond with legal action, the more it looks like they're hiding something. You think about what could have happened if things were handled differently from the start. A little transparency early on, a little less control over every single detail, and a massive amount of this just wouldn't exist. But we're way past that now. They've reached a point where every move they make is being analyzed from multiple angles. And honestly, people aren't even asking for everything. They're just asking for consistency. They want something that feels real instead of managed. Because at the end of the day, it's not really about the details anymore. It's about trust. And there's another layer to this that's actually kind of sad when you think about it. Archie and Lilibet are growing up in this incredibly controlled environment. They're far away from their family. They don't get those normal interactions that royal kids usually have with their cousins, their grandparents, the larger family structure. It's a very curated life, and maybe that was done to protect them, or maybe it was done to maintain control. I don't know which. But either way, it creates distance. And that distance doesn't just affect public opinion. It affects actual family connections. These kids are growing up without those shared experiences, without that sense of belonging to a larger family structure. And that shapes how you see everything as you get older. George, Charlotte, and Louis get to have normal royal kid experiences. Archie and Lilibet get Montecito and paparazzi and carefully managed photo releases. The thing is, from King Charles's perspective and from Prince William's perspective, they're not going to casually step into any conversation about verification or documentation without clarity. Because for them, it's not family drama. It's about the stability of the institution. The monarchy runs on tradition and public trust. If there are open questions around something as important as lineage, they're not touching that without answers. So what you've got is this invisible line. Harry and Meghan are still technically part of the family, but also completely separate from it. And that's an incredibly strange position to exist in. Financially, there's this pressure that keeps building. The deals they thought were going to be massive moneymakers either fell apart or came with expectations they maybe didn't anticipate. Netflix wants content that performs. People in Australia weren't receptive. Spotify dropped them with actual public criticism. And the Montecito house, the security, it all costs money. So they're kind of in this position where they have to keep people interested, they have to keep the deals producing, but every move they make to do that just adds more fuel to the questions. It's exhausting just thinking about it. The documentation part is what a lot of people miss when they're just following the drama online. Because here's the thing about records and protocols. They don't expire when public interest moves somewhere else. The royal family has been dealing with documentation for centuries. Everything gets filed, everything gets verified, and if there are gaps in what's supposed to be there, those systems don't just accept that and move on. They eventually push for answers. It might take time, it might be quiet, but it happens. That's the institutional reality that Harry and Meghan are dealing with, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. And it's not like the royal family is going to come out publicly and start demanding documentation. That's not how they operate. They protect the institution first. Everything else is secondary. So King Charles, Prince William, they're just sitting with this knowledge. They know there are questions. They know there are gaps. And their strategy is basically to keep distance and let it stay separate from the core of what the monarchy is doing. Because getting involved, asking questions publicly, that destabilizes the institution. So instead, they just don't engage. They don't react. They let Harry and Meghan exist in this separate space. Which brings you back to the core problem. Harry left because he wanted out of the pressure and the scrutiny and the constant attention. That was the whole point. But he's ended up in a situation where the attention is worse, the pressure is worse, and the scrutiny is constant, just from a different source. Instead of royal protocols and media regulations, it's Netflix contracts and public speculation and the need to constantly keep people interested. And the fact that he's constantly online reading everything, getting pulled into the noise, that's not the guy he was supposed to become. That's not what walking away was supposed to look like. There's also the question of whether any of this would have happened if there had been more transparency from the beginning. If Meghan had just been clear about timelines, if there had been normal documentation, if Archie had been presented the way royal children typically are presented, if there had been family moments that felt genuine instead of managed, if any of that had happened, a lot of this noise wouldn't exist. But instead, every closed door, every legal notice, every moment of silence just created more questions. And now they're in a situation where even if they wanted to open things up, the damage to credibility might already be done. Because here's what people actually want. They don't want to know everything. They don't want access to private family moments. They just want consistency. They want something that feels real instead of like a brand rollout. They want the story to make sense. And right now, it doesn't. The narrative they sold, privacy, peace, stepping away from pressure, doesn't match the reality of speaking tours and Netflix deals and high-ticket engagements and constantly being in the public eye. It doesn't match the reality of legal action and control and management. Those two things don't align, and people notice when things don't align. At the same time, you've got this situation where the old ways of managing perception just don't work anymore. When you stay quiet, it doesn't give people time to forget. It gives them time to dig deeper. When you respond with legal action, it doesn't shut things down. It makes people more curious. It signals that there's something worth protecting. And when you keep the same narrative, even though the reality has shifted, it becomes harder and harder to believe anything you say. Trust erodes slowly. Then all at once, the financial pressure is real too. And it's probably affecting the way they make decisions. Because when your income depends on your brand value, and your brand value depends on people being interested, you end up in this position where you need the very thing you're trying to escape. Harry needs the royal connection to stay relevant. Meghan needs the mystique and the controversy to keep generating interest. But they also need to present themselves as being above all of it, as being focused on meaningful work and privacy and family. Those things are contradictory. And the longer you try to hold both of them as true, the more people see through it. I keep thinking about what actually happens if they decide to go the other direction. If instead of shutting things down, they open things up. If they brought Archie and Lilibet into normal family moments. If they cleared up timelines. If they stopped fighting every question and instead just answered them. Would it fix everything? No. But it might change the nature of the conversation. Right now, people are speculating and questioning because they don't have answers. If they had answers, at least they'd have facts instead of theories. But the reality is, they're probably not going to do that because control is what they've chosen. Control of the narrative, control of the images, control of the timeline, control of who gets to see what and when. And maybe that feels safer than transparency. Maybe it feels like the only way to protect themselves and their kids. But it's not working. It's doing the opposite of what they probably hoped. It's creating more questions instead of fewer, more suspicion instead of trust. So you're left with this strange situation that doesn't seem to have a clean resolution. Harry and Meghan have built this separate world, but that world is still entirely dependent on the one they walked away from. The cycle keeps feeding itself. The more they try to control it, the more people question it. The more questions pile up, the more they need to control the narrative. And meanwhile, the royal family is just watching from a distance, protecting the institution, letting this situation sit in this weird separate space where it doesn't destabilize the core of the monarchy, but also doesn't resolve anything. At some point, they're gonna have to choose. Do they keep holding on to control and watch the speculation keep growing? Or do they take the risk of opening things up and dealing with the fallout of actually answering questions? Because the thing about credibility is once you lose it, it's incredibly hard to get back.